Hi. Hi everybody, welcome. There's no clock, so unfortunately I have to try and guess my own time, and I'm not very good at that, so I'll try not to run over. So we're going to do a presentation in sort of two halves. My bit is really going to be an overview of the background issues, so to give you some context, and then Paula's going to present her particular model of individual and group therapy with this client group, or these issues with the client groups. So, I'd also say that I work as clinical psychologist at the Ambrose King Centre at Royal London, and I've worked in HIV and sexual health services for about 10 years. And I got kind of interested in ChemSex and sexual compulsion really probably about 7-8 years ago, when we started seeing much more people coming through for help in our HIV and sexual health service there. And I met Paula last year when I decided if I'm going to do some work in this, I probably need some kind of training. So I did her diploma in sex addiction counselling and therapy, which I've just completed recently. And I've kind of introduced some of those ideas into the work I do now. My current clinical practice in ChemSex and sex addiction is a small specific clinic at the Ambrose King Centre that focuses just on these two issues. And it's an individual psychotherapy practice, so it's rather than a group therapy. So just to give a bit of context for me. I've done this presentation in the style of memes and GIFs, so I'm trying to make it just a little bit more relaxed. There's not a lot of figures, but there's quite a lot of stuff to cover. So it's going to be very broad brushstrokes as well, so you get really snaps of flavours of different things. So it's not an in-depth delve into any one of the issues, because actually we could probably spend a whole day on each of the issues. It's just to give a broad context. Okay, so this is what we're looking at. I'm going to look at really contextualising the ordinary experience of altering reality, a bit about GSRD, so diversity around sex and relationships, focusing on that contextualised within intersectionality, and then we'll focus on gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men. And ChemSex and interventions come within that as part of a kind of a funneling approach from the generic through to the specific. So, here we all are. We altering our reality, our perceptions of reality, our states of consciousness is a completely normal, ordinary, everything that we do. We do it as children. Kids go spinning round and roundabouts, they roll down hills. We do it through ingesting food substances. We go to environments that play music, that we move and shake our body to, and flashing lights, and in these kind of social and private spaces that alter our reality. We do it through foodstuffs to alter the food we ingest, which changes our state. There's nothing like me going down to Patisserie Valerie on a Sunday, buying an expensive cream bun and feeling good about myself. We do it in spirituality and religious practice, and of course us psy-complex professionals. When I mean by that, I mean anybody who's in the business of thinking about people's psychology or their minds. We do it as well. We do it through mindfulness, we do it through meditative practices, we do it through CBT, we do it through psychodynamic therapy, and we do it through chemicals like things like Prozac. So there's nothing ordinary about changing our states of reality. And of course, we do it in our sexual context as well. We change our sense of reality through our social interactions and the social processes that dictate how we present ourselves sexually, either through being open sexually or, in fact, the opposite. It's all a relationship to that. We change it by augmenting and altering our body shape. We do it through the clothes we wear and the way we present our faces and our bodies to other people. We do it through private spaces and public spaces, and we do it through rituals such as gift giving and food ingestion. So there's nothing at all unusual about what we're doing. Everybody does it. And of course, you're mostly all drug and alcohol professionals, addictions professionals. We use substances as well, so it's just another form of sexualizing our reality, and we do it through a whole range of things, alcohol being the most commonly used one, but all these other ones as well give us a different sense of our sexual beings and sexual connectedness depending on the substances that we use. So nothing unusual there at all. So that's a very broad context. Let's look a little bit more at GSRD stuff, so gender, sex, relationship, diversity. And this really comes on the challenge for heteronormativity. So the kind of traditional view that sex, gender, and relationships are done into binary categories, and these categories might have different dimensions to them, but they're binary in the sense that there's a masculine category and there's a feminine category. And GSRD really is there to challenge that and that notion of that. The Meg John Barker guidelines, I don't know if anybody's got a copy of it, but if you do, this is absolutely brilliant. I love these guidelines. They're really concise. She describes it. It's very broad, but she goes into great detail, and she gives absolutely brilliant examples and prompts for reflective practice. So this could be one of your team meetings. You've got to think about your relationship to GSRD issues and think about how then that might affect your perceptions of the world. So I definitely recommend that. So GSRD is a bit like a rope. So a rope is made of different separate strands, but these strands come to form a whole. So they are separable, but in fact they're also interlinked, interwoven, and interdependent as well in order to make a kind of cohesive whole. So separating them out is really kind of false, but unfortunately we have to do it so we can go through each of the elements that make up this kind of rainbow rope. So we've got dimensions around biology. Traditionally think about male and female, but we know that the biological categories are challenged at every single level of biology, from genetics through to hormones, through to tissue structure and body structure, through to cognitive processes. You know, being a psychologist, there's always been the field of gender psychology and the difference between how men think and women think. But actually we know that increasingly these are false dichotomies. And linked to biology is our identification, so our relationship to our biological identity. Cis, for those who don't know, means that your gender identity matches what your perceived biological identity is. So in my case, I'm a cis male. I'm biologically male and identify as male. Others, it varies, so non-binary would be people who really would not identify as any particular gender, and gender fluid, related to non-binary, is people who at different points in their life or different points in time will move and have a more fluid relationship with which gender they are at any one time. And then we move from the idea of gender identity to sexuality. The most common one we all kind of aware of are around sexuality, which is sexual attraction, orientation, and identification. So it's also divided into subgroups. So we might be attracted to a particular kind of sexuality or people of different genders, but we may not orientate towards that. We may not identify with that as a social construct. So through these, as you can see, there are constructs like male, female, gay, lesbian, straight, hypersexual, pan, that can be categorically pulled out as social identities. But in this sense, I would say it's more about your attractiveness to a particular gender or identified gender. Separating that as romantic relationships, and they're often interlinked, but they can also be separate as well. So you can be, for example, biromantic gay male. So you can fall in love with people of any gender, both genders, but actually only sexually attracted to one particular gender. So there's not a direct overlap. These things can vary. And along that dimension is sexual interest. It cuts across from people who regard themselves as not having any sexual interest, but who may be very romantically inclined, through to people who have fleeting and occasional sexual interest, to those who have sexual interest only when they're in the context of a romantic relationship, through to other forms of sexual interest. And I've added hypersexual here because they're on a continuum. And working in psychosex therapy, we often see some of these things coming as problematized. So asexuality being seen as anorgasmia or lack of arousal, and hypersexuality may be seen as problematic in compulsive sex. Okay, so already we're starting to see it's getting very complex and it all interlinks. And then with the composition of relationships, so the typical kind of most common seems to be single and couple, but actually there's a whole range of other types of relationship compositions. Through polyamory, where people agree to have within their composition additional partners as part of a romantic composed group, through to relational anarchism, which is essentially people who believe actually all my relationships are of equal value. I don't have any one particular person who is more special than another. It's just people give me different things in my life. And I think open and non-monogamy is fairly straightforward, but again on dimensions. So it's all interlinked. People cut across these different dimensions to form what they think is best for them. And added to that then is what we do in bed, what we like to do, where we like to do it, the practices we like to engage in. And there's a whole range of this, from vanilla through to BDSM and kink and all sorts of other stuff. And we could probably spend a couple of days just talking about that, actually. But we're not going to. So that's GSRD in a nutshell. It moves us away from this idea of binary normatives to something that's much more complex, much more interwoven, and actually where we have a much more individual relationship to it. But in gender and sexuality make up two components of a much broader construct, which is the idea of intersectionality, which again is something that stands in opposition to normativity. Intersectionality is our different identities, ethnicity, class, age, sexuality, gender, that all come together and intersect through, they may be oppositional, some of our identities might be discriminated against, some of them might have power. This picture is a picture of Suzanne Schenck. She's a chief executive of one of the top Wall Street financial institutions. So just looking at her, looking at us, we could think of the various intersections of our identity that come to and fore. So we have a middle-aged black woman in a position of power. So she's got powerful and dominant identities, and of course she's part of a capitalist institution, but she also has discriminated identities. And I thought it was really interesting that in the papers recently with Meghan Markle's mother, after people have been reading stuff, Meghan Markle was raised in West Hollywood, I think it was, but actually her mother was often seen as the nanny. So you've got this idea of power and wealth, but because of her ethnicity, people regarded her in particular kind of ways when she was with her daughter, because her daughter, of course, is mixed race. All right, and linked to this idea of normativity, and we're going to look at this a little bit more because I think it's important because it affects some of the aspects of how gay and bisexual men of sex with men interact with each other, is the idea of homonormativity. So we get this idea of heteronormativity, but homonormativity is the idea that, again, it plays with capitalist white power domination, and people who are whose sexuality and other intersections like ethnicity and age and ability are discriminated against within a homonormative model. Summary then, human experience is creating and altering reality. That's just what we do all the time. We're doing it now. From cups of tea, we're wearing makeup, we're wearing clothes. We do it through social, behavioural, and environmental means, and we do it internally through substances and foods. Gender, sex, and relationships are widely diverse, and they are just two components of wider intersections of identity that we all possess, and we should all really reflect on. And within sexual politics, there are normative notions of homosexuality which can lead to discrimination within that group. All right, we're going to focus a bit on gay and bisexual and men who have sex with men. I put this slide up because it's contextualising it. We've got to remember, in order to be ordinary, the whole LGBT movement has had to go through a whole process of political emancipation, through fighting for rights, through working through and overcoming serious health and disease processes, to reach the point now, really, where we're saying that gay, bisexual, men who have sex with men do the same thing as everybody else. They have relationships with their gender, their sexuality, how they have sex, where they have sex, the kind of people they have sex, how they do sex, how sex interacts with their ethnicity, their age, and their religious beliefs, and how they construct their families. There's nothing, and what substances use, what drugs they use to enhance sex. There's nothing unusual about that. So, beyond this, about doing what everybody else does, are there features in the lives of gay, bisexual men, homosexual men that might influence this ordinary phenomenon? And I've pulled again more memes that we're looking at here, developmental, social processes, people's developing identity as they grow up, their relationship to their culture, how their culture relates to them, their relationship to family. We're talking about people who may be frightened to tell their family, discriminated, rejected by family, rejected by community and culture, rejected by religion. Us ourselves, as good old psych-complex professionals, have been part of that. It was only until 1973 that homosexuality was discriminated against, was taken off DSM, and we still see percolating through even DSM-5 pathologising of sexuality and sexual practice, and we need to really be aware of that, I think. So how the person develops themselves, developing that relationship to themselves, but also the relationship to the world. And I would say there's a lot of heterophobia amongst gay people, and that's not straight hatred, that's straight fear, frightened of what straight people will do to them because of their experiences of community, personal and family violence that they've had throughout their lives. So this is already percolating through how people come to see themselves and form a relationship with themselves. In Western context, people are able to make connections with other LGBT people. They can form community, they can gain support, they can gain a sense of cohesion of their identity. They can meet people who've got similar interests to them. They can find sexualized environments where they're safe and they can experiment with. They can socialize. So these are great things. They give real kind of minority strength, a sense of identity and cohesion. But this homonormative stuff also occurs within this community. So there is stigma within the community. And it doesn't get talked about enough, I don't think. There's definitely HIV stigma when you try to go dating someone and they find that you're HIV positive. Then there are a lot of guys who are HIV positive find that very difficult kind of coming out process. Racism is just as rife within the LGBT community as it is in any other community. Ageism exists, and of course that whole kind of relationship to masculinity and femininity and body shape. And these, of course, all feed back into how people feel about themselves and how they relate to themselves in the world. So we can see that there are both positive, helpful influences, and there are influences that pull in the other direction for people. Excuse me. And we do know that actually, when you look at this stuff, LGBT mental health seems to be an issue. There definitely seems to be higher rates of things like depression and anxiety in this group of people than you would ordinarily expect. Given the context we just talked about, that's probably not very surprising, I suspect. We also see higher levels of substance use, recreational drug use, party drugs. It's always been around in gay and bisexual, GBMSM scenes. Alcohol, ecstasy, MDMA, all that kind of stuff's been part of the culture. But there is also a problematic relationship to it as well that we see. Obviously, physical health issues around HIV, so there's clearly some associations with that. And actually, at the community level, people, GBSM people and LGBT people are much more likely to experience violence from the wider community. It's only been less than a week that somebody had their head drilled in by an electric drill as it came out of a gay bar. So it's there and it's still here, okay? In fact, at Dalston Superstore at the weekend, 3 guys were sprayed with acid coming out of the gay club. So, this is happening and it still happens in this community. The other issue we don't really talk about, because it's a bit of a, well, we like our sex and we like sexual freedom, But I do get a lot of guys coming through with sexual compulsion and sexual addiction and having problematic sex. So it's not to say that there's only problematic sex. It's that some guys do present with their sexual behaviours and sexual lives as being problematic. All right, so how do we make sense of some of this? Because it's a bit confusing. We need models. So I've come across this fairly recently. Other people, it's been around since the 90s, the idea of syndemics. So syndemics is the occurrence of two or more epidemics or health and social problems that cluster around particular groups of people. So if we think about us, this group, we've got mental health, we've got potentially problematic substance use, we might have health-related issues around HIV, we've got community violence, and we may have some stuff around sexual behaviours. So there's a clustering. And with syndemics, it's not that these things happen in isolation, they're mutually influencing, they're almost like fusions of different epidemics, and they're underpinned by toxic social processes that precipitate the development of these. And when we look at the kind of life experiences and the social experiences from the communities outside and the community inside, and how people then develop their sense of themselves, it makes sense that these kind of toxic processes might come to form a syndemic around mental health, substance use, sex, and HIV, and various other things as well, I guess. I like this little slide here because it goes through different types of models. And the syndemic model that's interesting is that it's a feedback mechanism. So not only do you have your HIV and your mental health problems, but the fact that you've got these then reinforces the toxic social processes. So all the discrimination against people with HIV, well, they're gay, they deserve it. Yep, all those gay men, they're having sex anyway, so they deserve it. So it just reinforces the prejudice and the bigotry that is already present in the group, which then compounds the problem for these people. So you get caught in this feedback loop. So I think the idea of syndemics is like a really useful way to try and kind of formulate it. And this is I've nicked all this stuff. I didn't do this. I'm not clever enough. So it's like, this chap, Halkitikis, is kind of probably the big guy in syndemics in gay and bisexual men. All right, I'm aware I'm going over time because Paula's looking at her watch. So, am I doing all right? Okay. So it's just a snapshot of the model and how it flows through back into these processes. So you have HIV, you've grown up thinking you're different, and people have hated you, and you've got HIV, and actually people still hate you, and it makes you even feel more different. And not only feeling different from the wider world, because there's HIV stigma in the gay and bisexual community, actually you're feeling different from them as well. So you're even more isolated, and that's likely to drive you further into ways of coping with that and ways of dealing with that, which may be all kinds of things, I guess. All right, and this is a slightly different model. This is more linear, and I quite like this one as well because it really pulls out things like gay identity development and those early formative years that people experience, the sense of who they are. Right, so another summary. GBMSM create and alter their social experiences and sexual experiences just like everybody else does. Marvellous, and that's a great thing, and I'm glad that we worked for the last 50, 60 years to be able to achieve that and celebrate that. Syndemics helps us cast light upon coexisting, mutually influencing epidemics that fuse together, that cause feedback mechanisms that amplify the health problems. And common syndemics in the GBMSM community involves mental health issues, substance use, risk-taking, HIV risk, and the experience of violence from people outside and sometimes within their communities. Syndemics focus the lens upon contextualized social processes across the timeline of GBMSM, and that helps us think about, well, how we might intervene with that, and we'll come to that in later. So finally, I get to ChemSex. So ChemSex has to be really embedded within this wider context of where it comes from. And really we started seeing ChemSex as an issued party in place scene in New York and across America in the late 90s, early noughties. And it was certainly, it seemed to be more focused at that time around particular groups of metropolitan gay men, apart from the wider meth epidemic that's kind of across America, but in this particular group. And then it kind of died a death a bit, and then it sort of re-emerged itself, came back, and it's come back with a bit of a passion in New York. And certainly we saw it coming across the pond here about 10, 15 years ago. And I certainly started seeing it in our clinic, as I said, about 7, 8 years ago. First of all, a trickle, and now really lots of referrals. And interestingly, in my other job, which has got nothing to do with HIV and sexuality, I'm starting to see guys present with ChemSex in that as well. It was really interesting. So it's percolating across, and I'm sure you must be seeing people present with ChemSex issues in your services now as well. So we call it the unholy trinity. It's methadone, GHB, and crystal meth. So it makes you high and euphoric, it makes you horny, it keeps you awake, and in order to stop getting crystal dick, which means you can't get an erection, you take Viagra and you get an erection. So you're high, horny, sexy, you feel great, everybody else looks gorgeous. What's not to like about that? That sounds great, frankly. Wish I had some of that. Oh wow, that's really cool. And so you can see why people are going, wow, that's ace, you know. So some of the things that people say the ChemSex scene does and what makes it great for them. Well, for people who may be isolated, who maybe have difficult relationships themselves with other people, it can foster a sense of connection, intimacy, love, which they might not be getting elsewhere, or a sense of that. And there's intimacy in the emotional connectedness, because you do feel affection and you do feel this kind of sense with people. And people share lots of bits about themselves that they ordinarily hide and mask. And there's also ritual and connection in the drug taking process, as there is with any other kind of drug taking process. And there's a sense of looking after in some groups around making sure people don't overdose on G, who's going to do it, who's going to have the party. So there's a sense of subculture and community. We've got kind of literal spaces for where these rituals and these processes can occur. So very can really pull people in who may otherwise not have that in their lives. Sexual disinhibition allows you to do things, you want to do stuff, you do all sorts of things you might never tried before, things that you've really wanted to do but were too scared to do. You no longer feel you've got a fat bum, or you've got a big nose or a fat belly, or you're too skinny. Suddenly you feel like you're really sexy, and nobody else has got fat bums and funny faces. They're all really sexy as well. So it really enhances attractiveness and raises our kind of sexual self-esteem. So it moves us from this potential place where some of us, may well be, into something that's really quite transformed. And this kind of last line is also, it's a space for exploring danger and risk. And danger and risk is a really interesting idea, and it's something that BDSM community often embrace and kink community embrace, and we all do like a sense of danger and risk as part of our sexual experience, as part of our life experiences. We like danger and risk. And these spaces can also be that kind of opportunity and space to explore that as well. So people come for different reasons into this space. So that's all the great stuff. What's not so great? Well, Suicide Tuesday, you get that from lots of drugs. So totally depressed, come in. I see them coming in clinic. I have my clinic on a Tuesday. So sometimes the guys come in, they've been on all weekend, they're not in a fit state for therapy. They're really in a bad state. They need to go home and just chill out and look after themselves. Obviously, increase in STIs. We saw an increase in HIV. There was a big spike a few years ago. We got very worrying because when you're on crystal, you just don't even think about taking precautions. You're high. It's not where your mind's at. But PrEP's been introduced, and PrEP's changed that a bit, which is great. We see a rise in overdoses. G will kill you at really quite low doses. I think therapeutic doses up to about 1.5 millilitres. Overdose starts at about 2.2 to 2.5 millilitres. Okay, so you need to be really careful what doses you give. And we're also seeing meth deaths rising in New York as well. Other issues we're seeing, well, you know, when you come round, are you really having this really hot, great sex with people? How does that affect your sense of yourself when you come around thinking, actually, you know what, we have got big bums, we have got fat bellies, and what am I doing this for? So it really affects people's sense of what they're doing and how they're exploring their sexuality. And often people think, gosh, you know, people often feel that they're a bit damaged when they come through some of this stuff. Sexual dysfunction occurs. Sex without drugs is not so interesting, it's not so exciting, it's not so arousing. So it kind of pulls them back into this drug use. HIV concordance can go out the window. Like any kind of chaotic drug use will affect how you're able to adhere and concord to other medications that you're on. And also we're starting to see, because people are starting to ask it now, sexual assault and rape. You know, G is the date rape drug, so you can overdose someone on D and they'll fall into a coma. You'll make them unconscious. If we're seeing in ChemSex scenes guys overdosing, going into a coma, born unconscious, and being raped by other guys who are also high on drugs, and not identifying that this is sexual assault. And now, not only guys, this is happening to guys who are in these sex scenes. If I'm being raped and sexually assaulted, someone in the scene's doing it. So there's also a realization with some guys, oh my God, I've assaulted someone. So that realization afterwards. So this is a kind of, I'd say, a new aspect to it, an emerging aspect to it. And I say these ones in black are really stuff that I'm seeing in my clinic. That ChemSex, have never seen it start from meth addiction. I've only ever seen it start from sexual compulsion, moving into ChemSex, and then moving from ChemSex. Don't want the sex anymore, I just want the meth, thanks very much. So I'll have sex to have the meth, I don't really want it, but I'll have it anyway. Or I'll just start going to my dealer, cut out the sex stuff, and come home on a Friday night and smoke some meth at home. So I'm starting to see that moving, this kind of escalation of substance use. And of course, meth, like cocaine, fuses with sex. So when you try to have sex, you're triggered to have your meth, and vice versa, just a bit like cocaine. All right, so some of the approaches that we see in the community. There's never a presentation on ChemSex that cannot include David Stewart, because David Stewart's like our kind of like, I don't know, cover girl. He's our big guy. He's really been a huge influence in the promotion and service development around this stuff. But there's a whole range of stuff, from very specific ChemSex work in organisations like Antidote, GMFA, Dean Street, the gum clinics, but also actually in the wider context. And so we've got things like the Love and Man kind of movement, where actually it's not focused specifically on ChemSex, but it's about GBSM men coming together, celebrating, exploring intimacy, exploring vulnerability, exploring connectedness in a different kind of way. So I think that's a really important aspect. All right, and the final bit before I hand over to Paula, to really contextualise her model and where we're going with it, is that syndemic modelling allows us to have a whole range of interventions at the societal level which we're all responsible for. So we're responsible for influencing each other in a social, informal way about these things. But also the LGBT plus community is responsible for also influencing itself informally by being supportive, by not isolating, not discriminating against people who are involved in ChemSex scenes. To more kind of third sector organisations that might do recreational, might do outreach work in sexual spaces. A lot of the gum clinics go to saunas and such like. To where I started off in the generic gum clinics and substance use services, to the more specialist harm reduction services like Dave Stewart's work in Dean Street. And then where I am now, which is at the individual psychotherapy level. So I work with a much smaller group of people who have presented with complex stuff, and I offer 25-session therapy for individuals. So we can't offer that to everybody, but for more complex presentations. And I think that's kind of where we're going with Paula, to think about her model of looking at sexual compulsion, sex addiction, and how it might apply to the ChemSex population in that group and individual therapy context. So, I feel like I've gone on. Right, hope you... Right, okay, that's it. Final summary, basically what we've covered. Hopefully you've got a broad brushstroke of some of the issues. There's lots of complexity here, but I think we cannot talk about this stuff unless we address the complexity, because if we don't, we then fall back into stereotypes, and it's too easy to stereotype and caricature people. And then there's my final slide, a little library of resources for you, of books and stuff that I think are quite good. They all come with health warnings. Actually, Lost Method Men kind of sounds like a Pulp Fiction kind of stuff, but it's actually really good. So I do recommend that one. Velvet Rage, oh, that really enraged me, Velvet Rage, because it was very kind of, it was a bit homonormative, but it does pull out some of the issues that growing up gay and bisexual has for people. And if you don't read anything else, you must read Meg John Barker's guidelines. They're brilliant, and they're free to download. All right.
Thank you. Right, go bigger, don't close. Right, oh. Done that one. Where did we get to? This one, right. Sorry to correct you publicly, but I know this is being taped, so I think this is really important. Meg John Barker identifies as non-binary, so they wrote, not she wrote, so they wrote the guidelines. Sorry. So yeah, she identifies as non-binary, so yeah, it's Meg John Barker, and their guidelines for BACP are absolutely fantastic and very, very much worth reading. They're quite new, but they are live on the site now. Okay, so I'm going to pick up more from a sex addiction basis and talk a bit about how some of the sex addiction models might work with this community. And I think the first thing to understand, and in many ways Steve's kind of talked about this, but is recognising why so many people within these communities can be resistant to change. And some of the, the message we get is that actually these lifestyles are very much part of being part of the gay community. Obviously not for everybody, but actually this is kind of the heritage, if you like. An idea that talking about sex addiction is pathologising GSRD lifestyles. And this has been a historic problem for anybody working in sex addiction, and indeed it came up in the media last week. The idea that if you're saying that sex can be addictive, then you are or some sexual lifestyles can be addictive, then you are pathologising that particular lifestyle. I think if you just think about it logically, we don't pathologise alcohol, we pathologise the dependence on alcohol. That is what defines something as alcoholism, the dependency on it, in spite of harmful consequences. It's not actually what it is in itself. And with sex addiction, it's really important to recognise the type of behaviour is irrelevant, in as much as it's also irrelevant whether or not you drink whiskey or whether you drink gin or whether you drink beer or whatever it is. The flavour you're dependent on is completely irrelevant, and that is exactly the same in sex and porn addiction. It doesn't matter what flavour you prefer, it's the dependency on it that defines it as an addiction or a compulsion. I'm not going to get into that one. The other issue, of course, and those of you who are working with sex addiction will know this very well, it's not about abstinence, thankfully. It is not about abstinence, and this is the key difference working in sex addiction compared to any other addiction. It is not about abstinence. In some ways, it's more akin to the food addictions, but at least with food addiction, we do have some pretty straightforward guidelines. Yeah, we have our 5 a day, we have, calories we can count. We do have some globally recognised definitions of what a healthy diet is. There isn't really any such thing as healthy sexuality, and in fact I don't like the term healthy sexuality, because the opposite is unhealthy, and we've instantly turned it into a moral debate of some kind. So what is positive sexuality? And often they tend to come, as particularly some of the older writings on sex addiction, they come very much from a heteronormative viewpoint. It becomes about loving sex, intimate sex, and generally pretty heteronormative, monogamous views of what intimate sex means and what romance means. As if anybody, unless you're in a monogamous relationship, you don't know what intimacy is and you've never actually experienced it. And that is complete nonsense. So in order to treat sex addiction, you've got to be able to identify positive sexuality. And that is going to be very, very different for people in GSRD communities. Or it may be very, very different. It may not be. Sex will be boring, or indeed impossible, without chems. So working with the ChemSex community, talking about sober sexuality feels impossible, and indeed their experience of trying to have sex without chems may be that it was physically impossible. I have similar kind of experiences working with young guys. If you talk about masturbating without porn, and they just look at you like you are completely crazy. Like, actually, nobody masturbated till we got internet porn. That seems to be, if you're under 25, that's your belief. No man ever did it. Or woman. Of course, only men masturbate. But yeah, only men did it. But only when we got the internet. Before that, it had never been heard of. They think they invented it. So actually having a conversation about masturbation without porn is something that they have to learn is physically possible. And the same has to happen within the ChemSex community. But there is an element of it is going to be very different, and it may be boring at some levels, but it's looking obviously at what the gains can be. Losing community, and Steve talked about this very eloquently, there is a whole community that comes with this, and trying to get out of the ChemSex scene can be very difficult and can be very isolating. Very isolating. And nowadays it's not just happening within kind of the party culture, it's happening obviously on Grindr, just with individual hookups, but there's also a lot of couples who will be into the ChemSex scene. So actually, if one of you has become very dependent on this and really feels that you need to get out of it, you want to get out of it, this could also mean the end of your relationship. So there are a lot of couples where this is part of the fit, if you like. So a real sense of losing community. And of course that can happen in other areas as well, but I think even more so within communities that already feel isolated in the first place. So at the moment, generally what's been happening is that most of the work of the ChemSex community has been based on harm reduction. It's been based on other drug interventions. It's been trying to reduce some of the risks. But when they're not working, when people are coming back time after time after time after time, and this was a conversation I was having with Dave Stewart at Dean Street, that is when the idea that this actually is an addiction, a compulsion, whatever you want to call it, really starts kicking in. I think that is when you need to start thinking about how you might work with it through an addiction lens. So some of you will be, I'm not digressing, I'll get to it. Some of you are aware of this book that I wrote. It feels like it's really recent. It was actually 2011 I was writing it. It came out in 2012. One of the criticisms that I had about the book, and there were a few, some of them was it was very heteronormative, which was fair enough. There's now a whole chapter on GSRD and ChemSex. But the other criticism was that whilst there were quite a lot of models in it, there wasn't a very clear treatment approach, and various people were saying, so how exactly do you treat this? What's the actual structure and treatment approach for sex addiction? So what I'm going to introduce you to is what will be in the second edition. So the second edition of this comes out, we won't sell any more of these on the stand today. The second edition of this comes out in mid-August, I've been told. And as well as there being a whole chapter on ChemSex and working with GSRD, there's also the new treatment model, which I'm going to introduce you to. And what I found it really difficult to write a treatment model, and I think this is particularly relevant with this community, because I think the problem is when you have a model, as therapists, you then start trying to get your clients to fit into it. We all like to have some kind of plan, some kind of structure, but if it's too rigid, you're trying to shoehorn clients into it, it's not going to work. And I think this is particularly relevant with GSRD communities, where there is so much diversity, so many different ways of looking at what positive sexuality and positive relationships are. So whilst I say that this is a model, it's a kind of a loose one. It's much more of a kind of map to get you in the right direction. Having said that, it does follow an acrostic, and those of you that know me know I do like my acrostic. I've discovered that when I'm teaching abroad through translators, which I quite often do, acrostics are a right pain. So I can't wait to see how this is going to be like in Polish. I've done quite a lot of training in Poland, and it all completely falls apart. But anyway, so I've come up with the acrostic choice, and I think this is really important. So I do think addiction is in part about choice, and I know for some people in 12-step that's going to feel very controversial. It's not a choice to have an addiction, but actually the way that you work with it, the way you approach it, and certainly the way you want to live your life, the way you want to identify yourself sexually, romantically, the kind of lifestyle you want to lead is a choice. And I think the problem with sex addiction and the people within the ChemSex community that become addicted, and not everybody does, just to be clear, there are people within the ChemSex community for whom it's recreational and it's not at that level. It actually robs them of choice. They no longer have the choice, and I think addiction robs us of choice. It takes away our ability to choose the life that we want to lead and how we want to be. So that it's kind of a philosophy as well as a model. So I'm going to talk you through. I definitely want to make sure there's time for questions, so I won't waffle on. So the C stands for challenge core beliefs. I think I'll go into I'll go into each one in a moment. The H is about having a vision. The O is overcoming the compulsive behaviours, whatever they might be. The I is identify positive sexuality. C is connect with others, and the E is establish confident recovery. And I'm going to go through each of those quickly. So, challenge core beliefs. I think in a nutshell, the 40 core beliefs come under these headings. The first is I don't need to change, and that is, classically what we would call denial within addiction. I don't need to change. I do not have a problem. I don't need to change. And often, really, there's not a lot you can do at that stage. Talking about what the actual consequences are, what the potential consequences might be if you continue, where is this going to be in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time, can help to break through denial. But that, as we all know, is very difficult to work with. The next is I don't want to change, and I think that is where we really start getting into some of the motivational interviewing stuff. And I think particularly within the ChemSex community there is going to be a lot of loss. I think with any addiction there is loss. But I think it's really important working with GSRD communities to understand what that loss is and what it means to them, and to be able to empathise with that rather than just trying to be, but everything else will be so much better. The final one is I can't change, and I think that is where we really need to start working on those negative core beliefs. That sense that in some way I am faulty, I am broken, I have gone through too much, it's too late for me. And I think until we really engage with those faulty core beliefs, it's very difficult to get somebody into the process of change. I think psychoeducation is really important, and we're understanding more and more about the neuroscience of addiction now. And certainly in the group work programs we run, we put a lot of emphasis on the psychoeducational, because often feeling that you can't change, when you actually explain what's happening biochemically and saying actually craving is about what happens in the brain, it's not a psychological weakness. It is not about being weak-willed. This is about dopamine. Then that can help in itself to begin to reduce some of the shame and help people to think about moving forward. The H is have a vision. I think it's, and I've been obviously working in this field for a lot longer since writing that book. It is very hard for people to be really motivated to move forward until they know what they want, until they can really have a sense of who they are, who they want to be. I know it's a cliche, we're human becomings, we're not human beings, we're human becomings. We are constantly evolving and changing. Who you are now is not who you are going to be in 5 years, 10 years or 20 years time. Who do you want to be? What is the life that you want to have? And help people to really build a vision of the future. But it can't just stay as a dream. I think actually identifying some of the steps that are going to lead towards that vision and helping say, okay, you've got the bigger picture now. What's the first step? Now let's just worry about the first step. So then you get to the overcoming the compulsive behaviours. I mean, this is the stuff that you're working with all the time in addiction recovery. So being able to identify and avoid triggers, establish relapse prevention strategies, establish recovery routines. For many people, there's going to be underlying attachment and trauma issues. And when you're working with GSRD communities, there's going to be another layer again of those kinds of issues. So really being able to understand what's been happening for them there. Identifying what their intimate needs are and basically getting off the cycle of addiction. And some of you are familiar with the cycle that I use, but whatever model you use, helping them to really break through that and begin to move forward. Identify positive sexuality. So that is the bit that is often challenging, and I think that's the bit where, so my background is originally, 26 years ago, working in drug and alcohol for a couple of years, and then I trained as a sex therapist. And I do believe in, when you're working with sex addiction, really being confident about talking about sexuality, having very good awareness of GSRD issues, kink issues, all of that is really important, because there's, whoever you're working with, there's a lot of stuff out there. So for me, positive sexuality is something that is in line with your own personal value system. Obviously, it's got to be within the law as well, but your own personal value system. And I think when you're working in this field, you need to be very aware of what your own value system is, and be very aware as to whether or not where you're coming from is actually, leaking through to the client. Is this your value system leaking through? It has to be in line with the client's personal value system. Oh, went different order. It needs to be respectful of self and others. And as Steve was saying earlier, one of the real challenges within ChemSex is what happens with the G blackouts. And if you're completely high on drugs yourself, do you know if your partner gave you consent? Were they in a position to give you consent? Would you even have noticed whether they had or they hadn't if you were high on drugs yourself? It's a very tricky one. So being able to be respectful becomes quite challenging. Needs to be pleasurable, I would suggest. Mutually fulfilling when partners. It needs to be not shameful, and of course that is very much going to tie in with the first one as well, with personal values. And I think ultimately we should feel good about our sexuality. It should make us feel more confident about ourselves. It's something that builds our sense of self-worth and self-esteem. It is a positive activity. I think if your sexuality is leaving you feeling with shame because of it, you've crossed your own personal value systems rather than society's, then there's probably an issue there. Obviously, it needs to be GSRD, affirmative sex education as well, and a positive sex plan. And psychosexual therapy to overcome sexual dysfunction. So, I mean, this is important, working with people generally with sex addiction, particularly with those who are chronically addicted to pornography, but where there's been the ChemSex or any sex that's been with drugs, I think you need to be able to work from a psychosexual perspective in terms of sort of teaching sex education and helping them to overcome dysfunctions. So certainly when I'm working with clients with a porn addiction, if they can't get an erection, if they can't ejaculate without porn, they'll start by going back to the fantasy of it, and then it's just a matter of time before they go back to actually viewing pornography again. And as far as they're concerned, they have become wired to pornography. It is not possible to function normally without it. So it's really important to be able to do sensate focus work, teach mindful masturbation, and actually help people to overcome those sexual dysfunctions. Otherwise, they're just going to go back to it, understandably. Connect with others. I'm sure you're all familiar with Johan Hari's definition. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. It is so important to connect with others. And I think, again, within the ChemSex community, where so much of it is about the community, it is about that. Building a recovery community is even more essential. So I think doing group work within this community is perhaps more important than in any other. But the connection with others may be friends, family, partners, relationships, recovery groups, and of course 12-step fellowships. Establish confident recovery, and everybody knows recovery. Recovery in abstinence, recovery in sobriety are not the same thing. Recovery is something that you are in for the rest of your life. Recovery is something you can enjoy for the rest of your life. Recovery is not about what you give up; it's about what you take up. So establishing confident recovery. Really is about living again. It's not just getting your life back to where you were before addiction. It's actually really going into the next stage about personal growth and personal development. So learning to manage emotions in a healthy way, learning to develop assertiveness, establishing daily recovery disciplines. I'm going to change that. I just reminded me of a client this week who keeps on slipping. And he keeps talking about, I'm not disciplined enough, I've not been doing the step work enough, I'm not disciplined enough, I haven't been meditating enough, And it occurs to me the first time, we do use this word discipline. And actually, if we just reframe it as self-care, forget all of your disciplines. Because he keeps beating himself up time and time again that he hasn't been disciplined enough. And it just so taps into the messages of childhood and not being good enough. It's just self-care. So daily recovery self-care. Note to self, wonder if it's too late in the book. Anyway. Change that to disciplines. To self-care. Yeah, it shouldn't feel like a discipline. It's just got too many negative connotations. And obviously developing healthy pursuits and pastimes. So, summary. Working in ChemSex requires a multidisciplinary approach. Sexual health is, of course, really important because the sexual health risk that Steve talked about. We need to be able to work with sexual health services. We need to work with chemical addiction recovery as well, depending obviously on how severe the addiction is to the chems, but being able to co-work it depends what environments you're in, but there certainly needs to be the chemical addiction recovery work as well. Sex addiction recovery. That bit's got to happen. They are so fused, the chems and the sex. You can't just get recovery from one and think the other one's going to get right on its own. It's just not going to happen. They're too fused. And psychosexual therapy to be able to overcome sexual dysfunctions and really learn about sober sexuality. And all of that, of course, has got to happen from a GSRD affirmative approach. I'll just leave that up. Dot on past. Open to you for Q&A. Do you want to join me back up here? And I think we're both mic'd up. Any questions? And I'm told there's a roving mic, and because this is being filmed, we've got to make sure you speak into the mic so that it goes onto the tape. I don't think you're allowed to sit over there, though, because the camera's there. Drag a chair over.
Right.
Yeah, I was told you were meant to stay within this square foot. Get told of. It's all rules. Any questions? They're overwhelmed. I thought there'd be loads of questions. You think one to kick them off?
Hi, thank you for that. So, I'm really sorry, I can't remember your name.
Steve.
You spoke about the sort of sexual advantage taking and things like that, and people predatoring and prey. And you spoke very much...
I wouldn't say predator and prey.
Okay. Yeah. Not predator and prey. But how many clients do you find coming into situations that have had their power taken away, that find they have been raped and have been brought into the ChemSex scene against their will?
Oh, I don't know about being brought into the ChemSex scene against their will. I mean, there's reasons why people go into the ChemSex scene that may be choices or that they make because of other things that are happening in their lives. So that's a slightly different question. I've never come across somebody being taken into it against their will. I have once or twice come across guys who have been out and been partying in clubs with their mates and friends, have gone to a party and then the chems were happening and they had never used chems before and they've come for some support afterwards. So that's definitely happened. and they may have had some unwanted sex during that time. Much more commonly that we're seeing is guys who are happy to be part of the ChemSex scene, they're enjoying, they're embedded within it, but when they are having blackouts due to G, waking up a few hours later, or kind of regaining partial consciousness during when someone's having sex with them, or groups of men are having sex with them. And a bit like, when we're talking about women who get raped and sexually assaulted, the kind of this confusion in their minds of, well, I was at a ChemSex party, I was having sex with guys, so is that really sexual assault? But actually, so there's lots of non-recognition of it. And I'm not sure if it was Dean Street or one of the clinics that started specifically asking people around unwanted sexual experiences, and they were quite high reports. I think it was about 30-40% of people reporting having had unwanted sex. And within that, of course, when they were asking these questions, they were also coming across guys who were going, oh, I've done that to someone. And then, of course, there's consequences for them of thinking about what they've done to someone. So quite devastating.
My name's Sebastian Punicalli. I'm a consultant addiction psychiatrist. I thought your talk was incredibly interesting, actually, and valuable to my learning. One of the things I've been seeing increasingly is sort of more and more people presenting with ChemSex issues, both in my NHS and private practice, and it has been a challenge treating them, and I think often sort of raised lots of different issues in my mind around some of the things he talks about around sort of heteronormative thinking, I suppose, in a way around you don't want to be sort of putting across your ideas on what's healthy or what's not. But I was just wondering what your thoughts are around, because I've got sort of people that come to see me and say, well, look, I attend ChemSex parties, but I'm doing it safely, and I don't think it's an issue. And I suppose they're sort of presenting in that kind of denial stage in a way. And sometimes it's quite hard to sort of argue a case against it in a way. You sort of say, you talk about the harms and the potential risks, but the message doesn't always seem to sort of embed. And I think there are those people who also kind of struggle with relationships, and I don't want to kind of be heteronormative and say to people that, it'd be more healthy for you to sort of have a sort of relationship rather than going to lots of sex parties every, however often. So it's sort of, I'm aware of my own sort of concepts and notions in my head. There are people who are sort of arguing, well, actually doing this occasionally or doing it in a certain way isn't necessarily a problem, and I think it's very difficult, really. And there's lots of sort of mixture of different services available and sort of rehabs and other. And I think it's great to sort of met you both in a way, because I'm not still aware of that many sort of very, skilled therapists and others that are available in the area. We had contact with a few in Esprit and a couple of other people.
Yeah,
I would always, in those situations, because this comes up in sex addiction all the time, where how do you know when it's recreational and how do you know when it's a problem? And you can't measure units, there's no immediate side effects. Is it actually telling the question, how would you know if it is a problem? What would be the signs for you that this was becoming a problem? And help them, to tell you, well, if I was doing it more than, well, if I found that I was. And a lot of this is kind of motivational interviewing skills, but getting them to think about what it would look like. And the bit about having a vision as well. Yeah. So do you imagine you'll still be doing this in 5 years' time, 10 years' time? Where would you like to be then? Can you see, is your behaviour now get in the way of you achieving those goals that you want in the future? So I think it's just developing that attitude of curiosity to get them thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to approach it. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. At the kind of wider level, there's more community responses as well, and you can kind of push people towards information or groups, or even just generating that discussion amongst the people themselves. And I think it's starting to happen with with ChemSex. People in the GBMSM community are starting to talk about it a lot more in a way that's maybe not quite so pathologising, because it was it's seen as something that people other each other all the time. We're designed to do this, and we've got to be careful that we do this to each other, that we discriminate against each other by and excluding people. people in the ChemSex scene do it amongst people in the ChemSex scene. The guys who slam crystal meth versus the guys who smoke it. I'm not one of those ones that slam it. God, they've really got problems. I just smoke the stuff. So, so allowing that conversation to happen in the community, I think is really important. But at the individual level, I really think, those motivational interviewing points, but what's your vision, where's your life going? I've never seen anybody in ChemSex, actually it's true for addiction, you've never seen anybody really successfully come away from this if they haven't got a vision for the future. Yeah, if you're only running away from it, you're never going to escape it. You've got to be running towards something.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Paula, I think for you, what impact do you see on the porn addiction? Is that escalating? What impact do you see that having, and what are we going to do about it? Easy questions.
Yeah, it is massively escalating. I mean, the oral centres increased in size. We've quadrupled in size over the last 2-3 years. And it starts with porn, but then you've got all the adult hookup sites, you've got all the massage sites, you've got all the sex worker sites, you've got all the cam stuff, you've got, it's the apps, everything. I mean, that's just kind of where it starts. There's so much other stuff on there. It's a huge issue, and I think it's got to be about education. We're never going to stop pornography, and indeed there are many people, many of us who wouldn't want to. What consenting adults choose to do is completely up to them, and it doesn't, for many people it's not a problem, it is recreational. But we're never going to be able to completely block it. That is to under 18s. Some of the government trying to do that is somewhat naive. Google, how do I get around this block, and you'll find a nice 14-year-old who's done a video on YouTube showing you how to get around the block that your mum and dad have just put on. Or if you ever wonder or surprised at how many young people know what breast, penis, vagina is in a foreign language, it's because that will get you around most porn blockers, because they tend to be done on the basic language. So, it's just nonsense. And that's not to say we shouldn't do it in the same way as we put alcohol on top shelves and stuff, but it never stopped young people drinking, did it? It's got to be education. We have got to start having education, and that's going to be very difficult until it's got more recognition. And I think hopefully compulsive sexual behaviour disorder getting into ICD next year will really shift things forward. Hopefully that then means we'll start taking it far more seriously, and then we'll have to start educating.
Yeah, I would add that from the sexual health service perspective, we've definitely seen increases in guys and some women but presenting with sexual dysfunction, so erectile problems, premature ejaculation issues, really predominantly emerging from excessive use of porn, for sure. And a kind of slight cry for help around psychosex services in NHS. I'd say we've seen really fragmentation of that in the last few years, and a really cutting back of that, and at a time when actually there's a much greater demand coming through because of things like porn addiction.
Oh, it's a going up there.
Thank you. Hello, I'm a family lawyer and a divorce lawyer. And the courts are taking kind of quite a sort of simplistic view of things. They think that if you have a ChemSex problem and it affects your job and you get fired, then your own capacity is going to be back up and running in a relatively short amount of time. So they're making orders on the basis that people are going to recover quite quickly and then get back in the saddle. And I just want to know from your professional perspective really what the realistic timeline is. Once people are affected by this, when do you think they can realistically get back to how they were and to start leading a more, in inverted commas, normal life?
I think that's going to depend where they are on a continuum. I mean, you've got people with really, really, really severe addictions. I mean, just think, you're alcoholic, lost absolutely everything, litre of spirits a day, been doing that for 20 years, and you've got someone who really drinks a bit too much at the weekend and needs to get a grip. How quickly is it going to take them to recover? it depends. It depends on the support network they've got around them as well, because it's very difficult, I think, to recover from addictions in isolation. So it depends on the support from family, the support from the recovery community. It depends. Anything between instantly having made the decision I'm never doing it again and never.
Okay, so from my that's really not great. From my professional perspective, I guess lawyers, we should be telling the courts that they shouldn't take such a simplistic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely. That's a take-home message.
And to err on
Complex.
caution. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this, it's great. I really agree with what you were saying about the group work in particular. At Antidote we run a structured weekend programme, and we run it for 4 weeks looking at all the underlying issues. And what is really effective is the peer support and the intimacy and the community that's created during those 4 weeks.
Yeah, thank you. It'll be good to find out a bit more about what you do.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it needs to be kind of both, really. Some people, the group support is all they need. Other people, they need individual support in addition to group support. But
yeah, they usually go on to do that because we're already laying the foundations of what are you going to do next.
Yeah, the recovery community is really, really key, I think.
Hi, I work with Tony at Antidote. I also do, I wear many hats within the gay community. So I also work with David Stewart at 56 Dean Street, running a gay discussion group called A Change of Scene, which is a monthly event. I'm also involved in the Loving Men festival as well. So I'm kind of all over the place. Typical addict, want everything, have to be everywhere. But I just to reiterate, I think from my point of view, one of the hardest and most challenging things is in the education. So I've been trained in this primarily as a drama therapist, but a ChemSex and drug and alcohol counsellor for the last couple of years now. And I'm quite shocked how many professionals I meet, both within the LGBT community and within the wider therapeutic general community as well, who just, it's not about blaming, but who have a lack of reading this stuff and understanding it, because it's in my opinion, it's so complex. I agree with you. You could have been. I would have gladly listened to 3 or 4 hours of just on understanding the underlying traumas of growing up gay. Stuff that Alan Downs talks about. I don't know if anyone's come across the book Straight Jacket as well, which was written.
Yeah, it's a really good book.
Which talks about the level that we're dealing with here, and somebody who might come into in answer to a question that was asked, what is problematic behaviour and how do we know what is problematic behaviour? Anyone who walks through the doors of Antidote or my private practice, the very fact that they've come to me for help, that is suggesting to me that is problematic use of behaviour. How they go about that, whether they choose harm reduction, whether they choose abstinence, that's entirely up to them. But I think there's a lack of information by healthcare professionals that are giving all the options available. And I think But
I think this is where we've got to get that collaborative approach. There has got to be the addiction specialist, the sexual health specialist, the psychosexual specialist. And at the moment they're just not talking. Those communities aren't talking to each other enough, and we've just got to get more holistic. I mean, when I met Dave Stewart the first time, he said, "So, is sober sexuality possible?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, of course. Been working with that kind of stuff as a sex therapist for 25 years." And he was like, "Really? So how do you do that?" It was just, I'm talking about basic sex therapy stuff that has been around for donkey's years, but that is something that's completely new.
I'm happy to go on record and say sober sex is absolutely possible.
But how do you teach it? And of course, as a sex therapist, you learn how to teach this stuff. But
that it's reflective, I think, of within our own gay community. Those conversations are not happening, and the experience itself of growing up LGBT is a very separate thing, and that's why the desire for community is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's even broader than that. I mean, masculinity, male sexualisation. I mean, men learn to masturbate and they don't connect their minds with their bodies.
Yeah.
So when I work with men generally in sexual well-being, we're often teaching men just to be in touch with their own sexual bodies, and that's really kind of core for psychosex work. So it's not even just a gay, bisexual, MSM issue, this is a broader issue, because it all impacts on gay men, for sure. I agree with the false dichotomies between different professional groups and service configurations, and I think that's where ChemSex and other things fall through the gaps, and it's really problematic. And we struggled in our service because we were all kind of psychosex, sexuality, that's the kind of stuff we were doing, and then we were getting the drug addiction coming through and going, what are we going to do with this? How do we do with this? And we go and talk to local drug and alcohol people who've gone, oh, sex, oh bloody hell, I don't know what to do with that. Sorry guys, you know. So we're still in a real kind of learning curve and really kind of evolving services and support.
So can I just say one other quick thing? This is generally to anyone who also is looking for, if you do have clients who are looking for pathways into, you know, we just more community group stuff. Our drop-ins and Antidote are in twice a week in King's Cross and Soho. Please come and chat to either Tony or I, who can give you more information about that, because there is a wealth, including your services as well. But I think we exist sometimes quite separately. So
sure.
I'm all about kind of communicating and working together. So, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Hi. To enhance my feelings of complete utter depression in the mornings, I read the Daily Telegraph. And I was
for which to alter your reality, isn't it?
So, I was reading the letters section this morning, and a gentleman, very disgruntled gentleman, was who had written a letter regarding telltale GPs, and he'd gone to his GP with an alcohol problem. And the GP had promptly warned the DVLA, and he had his licence removed, and now he's got to go to court. I was just wondering, in your work, what are your limits of confidentiality? What are the things what level of confidentiality can the patient expect? At what point do you have a statutory duty to inform the police or the authorities or whatever? For example, you were mentioning people who are coming along saying, well, I didn't really want sex, you know, I've gone to this ChemSex party and this has happened and I didn't want it. And then some guy has realised perhaps he has committed rape, inadvertently perhaps, because his own senses have been diminished, or his judgment clouded. So at what point does he have to fear that perhaps confidentiality is going to be breached and that you have a statutory obligation? And how do you advise patients of this before they start unfolding all their inmost secrets to you?
Shall I do the statutory bit and then you can do the NHS?
Yeah, quite similar, there's overlap.
Well, so there's a huge difference between statutory and ethical. Statutory responsibilities and ethical responsibilities. Our statutory responsibility as therapists is under the Terrorism Act, Treason Act, Money Laundering Act. I've forgotten one, Nick. That's it. No. Drug trafficking. Is that it? So money laundering, drug trafficking, treason and terrorism, we have a statutory responsibility report. Okay, so it's BACP, UKCP guideline. That's the law. If you do not report your client, you will have broken the law. That's the statutory requirements. Then there are ethical requirements. So most of us will say that ethically we have a responsibility to breach confidentiality if we believe the client is at immediate risk of harm. So if they say, I'm going to go out and kill myself, or that by breaching confidentiality, we could stop a serious crime from happening. So if they say, I'm about to get in a car drunk, or I'm going to go and kill somebody, or I'm going to abuse a child, or whatever it is, we have an ethical responsibility to report that. And even though we will have breached confidentiality, our professional bodies would defend us. Okay, the Children's Act is much more complicated, and that tends to be within different statutory and NHS organisations. So this comes up a lot with pornography for the people who viewed an underage image, and underage is under the age of 18. It's not 16, it's 18. And there is no statutory duty to report that someone has looked at an underage image. However, some people will have, and indeed you could be struck off if you did breach confidentiality on that, if your client didn't know you were going to do it. You can't prevent risk of harm to a child. It's already happened. It's too late. Yeah? You can't actually prevent harm from that. But the guidelines may be different within different organisations. So the NHS, your individual practice, wherever you work, whatever antidotes policies are, they may vary and may be different, but they're ethical rather than statutory. The statutory ones are just, you can murder somebody. I murdered someone yesterday. We have no duty to report. Going to murder him tomorrow. You still don't have a statutory duty. Ethically, you do. So.
Yeah, I think that's really clear. Yeah, I think
different places have their own guidelines. The key is you have got to be very clear with your client what they are. And one of the issues I have with the Children's Act is if you tell me any harm's going to come to a child, often people lump underage pornography in there and actually haven't really thought about it and haven't really thought, 17-year-olds and you're 19. Oh, in that case, no, it's fine. I'm not going to report you. They don't actually know what the law is. That's definitely a whole other talk.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I would agree. I'd say there are variations about ethical aspects of how you report in different organisations with different structures, but actually they're essentially the same. Yeah. And you would be upfront with people around that. But it is about prevention of reducing risk, prevention of crimes happening, prevention of future harm to someone.
Thank you. My question, really mainly to Paula, really. I think, it's a statement as well, I think. In my experience when working in addiction treatment, we get a lot of presenting clients with the substance misuse, presenting substance, alcohol and drugs. And the time that we have with them, there is an increased, obvious presenting issues around sex addiction as well. And, the referral-on pathway, there are limited places that some of us might be aware of, as opposed to lots of self-help groups and lots of other support around other addictions. And I think the more that we're treating addiction as addiction and looking at it as addiction all the time, hopefully, things will
but
get
sobriety ain't sobriety. I totally agree, addiction is addiction. But when it comes to sex addiction, sobriety is completely different.
And so my question really is that what we've also seen outside of that is there's a lot of people in recovery for drug and alcohol, NAA or whatever it is, with a lot of, now the next presenting issue is sex addiction and more complex cases, and it's taken a lot of people back out, and it's more than just going to a meeting. There's other things there, and some of the actual complications I've noticed around people that have been in recovery a long time is they've built their lives up, and they've got wives and they've got husbands and they've got families. And the enabling behaviour, in the sense that the partners are even involved in allowing certain behaviour, or enabling certain behaviour, getting partners for them, especially within the ChemSex community of some clients I work with. They're bringing partners round and they're not part of it, or including heterosexual relationships, taking them to parlours and things. Is there anything you guys have experienced to help involve those families, to help looking at those complex cases? Some tips that you would share?
So we do a 6-day intensive recovery program for sex and porn addiction, and we have a lot of referrals from other rehabs, so do feel free to do that. Then that's very specifically working on the sex and porn addiction and identifying positive sexuality. We also provide support for partners, support groups for partners. I have to say, I have not come across at this stage the situation that you're all talking about in terms of educating Oh, have I? The thing is, I mean, again, and this is different from any other kind of addiction, isn't it? If your partner is a sex addict or is going to get into recovery from sex addiction, it's going to affect you. If you're having sex, however often, with that person, it's going to affect you. It may be that, and just because your partner gives up alcohol doesn't mean that you can't have a drink, or you can't have a drink with mates even if we're not going to drink in front of you. But when you're talking about positive sexuality, that is very much going to affect you. So it's a conversation that has to be had with the partners and has to be had with the couple or with a group or whatever, about actually what does positive sexuality mean to you, and how are you going to communicate that with a partner? What impact is that going to have on the relationship? And again, that really is unique with sex addiction compared to any other kind of addiction.
Yeah, that's great.
You are depriving your partner of their sexuality, possibly.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I think that's probably the last question, that one. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for that. It's really generally about psychosexual therapy itself, of how to encourage people to actually access it. It's my experience, I get quite a few, as a therapist in private practice, I get a lot of alcoholics, drug addicts, and sex is in the background, it's not their primary. But generally, I find people don't come to you for sex therapy. I have a psychosexual background training as well. That comes if you see a couple, it comes down the line, the sexual issues. It's always something else. And having spent 2 years working as a sex therapist at Guy's Cancer Centre, they changed the referrals from where the nurse could fill out the forms to the client had to fill out, the patient had to fill out the forms. And our referrals just plummeted. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts on how we can get rid of that, lessen the shame of asking for help around these issues.
I mean, in some respects, you're kind of asking the wrong person, because I am a sex therapist, so I never have to get them to come and see me. If you know what I mean, by the time they're there, the job's been done. I think some of it is just how we talk about sex and sexuality, and just talking about it so much more open. I do a lot of talks within sexual health clinics and with sexual health workers, and one of the things I suggest, we have got to start saying, how much porn do you watch in intake? Not do you watch porn, if indeed you even have the question on there. We say how many units of alcohol do you drink a week? We don't say, do you drink alcohol? We say, how many units do you drink a week? We just assume everybody drinks. We've got to start doing that with porn. It's got to be, roughly how many hours a week do you spend watching porn? And I think that in itself is going to make it a heck of a lot easier for people to, and just asking about sexual functioning. And because I've been a sex therapist for so long, I have to remember the times when you're not meant to talk about stuff like that. Because it's just, normal parlance for me to talk about erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation.
I agree. I think because we work in a particular field and area, actually this is just common parlance for us, and it's not until you're outside that people are going, oh God, you're talking about this stuff, oh goodness me. Part of my other job is working in autoimmune conditions, so medical long-term conditions, and actually, of course, within that there's a huge psychosex problem, sexual well-being problem. So it's not so much, I think what the point you're making is really not really talking to the converted here. It's about how do we get nurses in a GP clinic, how do we get medics in an outpatient department to have that conversation with people who may have a whole range of kind of complex social, physical health concerns, to give a space to sexual well-being or sexuality, which just tends to get closed down. But I think in the NHS, they've introduced these kind of requirements we have around asking the alcohol and drug question, and you refer them on, or the smoking question. We thought about, do we ask a sex question? But that feels a little bit too robotic. But I think maybe there's just a wider dissemination and conversation to have amongst colleagues who don't specialise in these areas about how to just kind of normalise a conversation with sex. We could talk about people's health, what's going on with their bits and their
How are
bodies.
your bowels?
But God, talk about what you do with your bowels. It's something they're going to do. We don't want to go there.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. I think that is